The world has decided to go green. Solar panels, wind turbines, electric vehicles, clean batteries. The future of energy is settled. What isn't settled, and what almost nobody is talking about loudly enough, is who controls that future. Because the green energy transition isn't just an environmental story, it's a resource story, a supply chain story, a geopolitical power story. And right now, that story has one dominant character. Not America, not Europe, not the oil-rich Middle East. China, a country that looked at the green energy transition 20 years ago and made a decision the West is only now waking up to. It decided to own it, not participate in it, own it, from the ground up, literally. Today, we're going to trace exactly how China did this, what it controls, what it cost, and what the West can realistically do about it. And at the end, we're going to look at the cracks, because China's green dominance is real, but it is not invulnerable. Welcome to Context Missing. Let's follow the supply chain. To understand China's green energy dominance, you need to start underground, because every solar panel, every EV battery, every wind turbine begins as a rock. The green energy transition runs on minerals: lithium, cobalt, nickel, manganese, graphite, rare earth elements. These are the ingredients of the clean energy economy, and China has spent the last 2 decades systematically acquiring control over as many of these ingredients as possible, not just inside China, but across the entire planet. Let's start with rare earth elements, 17 metals with names most people can't pronounce that are essential for everything from wind turbine magnets to EV motors to defense electronics. China produces approximately 60% of the world's rare earth elements, but that number understates the real dominance. China processes approximately 85 to 90% of the world's rare earths, including ore mined in other countries. The raw material might come from Australia or the US, but it goes to China to become usable. This processing dominance is the key. Mining is the visible part. Processing is where the real control lives, and China built that processing infrastructure over decades while the West wasn't paying attention. In 2010, China briefly restricted rare earth exports to Japan during a territorial dispute. Japanese manufacturers, who depend on rare earths for electronics, panicked within weeks. That incident was a preview, a demonstration of leverage, and the West watched it happen and largely did nothing to reduce its own dependence. Now let's talk about lithium, the element at the heart of every rechargeable battery, every EV, every grid-scale energy storage system. The world's largest lithium reserves sit in the Lithium Triangle: Chile, Argentina, and Bolivia. South America holds roughly 60% of known global lithium reserves. China doesn't have much lithium in the ground, but China figured out early that you don't need to own the mine. You need to own the processing and the companies that do the mining. Chinese companies have acquired stakes in lithium mines across Chile, Argentina, Australia, and Zimbabwe. They secured offtake agreements, guaranteed purchase deals that lock in supply for decades, and then China built the world's dominant lithium processing industry at home. Raw lithium from South America and Australia flows to China, gets refined, and comes out as battery-grade lithium ready for manufacturing. The result: China controls roughly 60% of global lithium refining capacity. Even lithium that starts its life in Chile often passes through Chinese hands before it becomes a battery. This is the pattern you will see repeated across every critical mineral. China doesn't need to own every deposit, it needs to own the choke point, the processing step that every deposit must pass through. Own the choke point, and you control the supply chain, regardless of where the raw material comes from. Let's talk about cobalt, because this one has a human cost that the green energy narrative rarely confronts honestly. Cobalt is essential for the lithium-ion batteries that power EVs and consumer electronics. Over 70% of the world's cobalt comes from one country, the Democratic Republic of Congo. The DRC is one of the most resource-rich and most politically unstable countries on Earth. Its cobalt mines have been documented sites of child labor, dangerous working conditions, and extreme poverty. And China's relationship with DRC Cobalt is comprehensive. Chinese companies control an estimated 15 of the 19 largest cobalt mining operations in the DRC. This happened not through military force or colonial imposition, but through investment. When Western companies were pulling out of an unstable country, Chinese companies were moving in. They took the risk. They built the relationships, they signed the contracts, and now they control the supply of a mineral the entire green energy transition depends on. Here's the uncomfortable truth the green energy conversation in the West rarely includes. Your Tesla, your solar panels, your clean future runs on cobalt from mines that Chinese companies control in one of the world's poorest countries. That's not an argument against green energy. It's an argument for being honest about what the green transition actually involves and who currently holds the keys. Now let's move up the supply chain from raw materials to manufacturing, because this is where China's dominance becomes truly extraordinary. Solar panels. China manufactures approximately 80% of the world's solar panels, not 40%, not 60%, 80%. This didn't happen because China has the most sunlight. It happened because of a deliberate, sustained, government-backed industrial strategy that played out over 15 years. In the early 2000s, Western companies, German, American, Japanese, dominated solar panel manufacturing. The technology was largely developed in the West. China looked at solar manufacturing and made a calculation. This is a scale game. Whoever builds the biggest factories, trains the most workers, and drives down costs the furthest will win. The Chinese government subsidized solar manufacturers massively. Cheap land, cheap loans, cheap electricity, tax breaks, and guaranteed domestic orders. Chinese solar manufacturers scaled up. Costs plummeted. Western competitors who couldn't match the subsidized Chinese prices went bankrupt one by one. Solyndra in the US, Q-Cells in Germany, Evergreen Solar. The list of Western solar companies killed by Chinese competition runs to dozens of names. By the early 2010s, the game was essentially over. China had won solar manufacturing so decisively that rebuilding Western capacity would take decades and cost hundreds of billions of dollars. And here's the bitter irony. Western governments' push to deploy solar panels as fast as possible to fight climate change accelerated Chinese dominance. Every cheap Chinese panel installed in Germany or California strengthened the Chinese industry that was displacing Western manufacturers. The battery story is even more striking because batteries are the single most important technology in the entire green energy transition. Batteries store solar and wind power, making intermittent renewables viable at grid scale. Batteries power electric vehicles. Batteries are the bridge between the energy we generate and the energy we use. Whoever controls battery manufacturing controls the green energy transition. Full stop. China produces approximately 75 to 80% of the world's lithium-ion batteries. Its dominance spans the entire value chain, from raw material processing to cell manufacturing to battery pack assembly. One company sits at the center of this, CAT-AL, Contemporary Amperex Technology Company. Founded in 2011 in Fujian Province, now the world's largest battery manufacturer by a wide margin. CAT-AL supplies batteries to Tesla, BMW, Volkswagen, Toyota, and dozens of other global automakers. The cars may be German or American, the batteries are almost certainly Chinese. CAT-AL's market share of the global EV battery market exceeds 35%. The next largest competitor, South Korea's LG Energy Solution, is at roughly 14%. China's BYD is third. Two of the top three global battery manufacturers are Chinese. The battery supply chain is, for practical purposes, a Chinese supply chain. And the gap is widening, not narrowing. China is building new battery gigafactories faster than the rest of the world combined. Let's talk about wind energy, because most people assume this is where the West still has an edge. It doesn't. Europe invented modern wind turbine technology. Danish company Vestas, German Siemens Gamesa, these were the global leaders for decades. China applied the same playbook it used for solar: massive government support, rapid scaling, relentless cost reduction. Today, Chinese wind turbine manufacturers, Goldwind, CSSC, Envision, dominate the domestic Chinese market completely and are aggressively expanding internationally. China installed more wind power capacity in 2020 alone than the entire rest of the world combined in 1 year. And the turbines getting bigger, offshore wind turbines that stand taller than the Eiffel Tower, are increasingly coming from Chinese manufacturers who have invested in the next generation of technology, while European competitors struggle with supply chain costs and financing. Siemens Gamesa, Europe's largest wind turbine maker, has been losing money for years. It required a bailout from its parent company, Siemens Energy. Meanwhile, Chinese competitors are profitable and expanding. The wind energy story is following the solar energy story, with a 5-year lag. If current trends hold, Chinese manufacturers will dominate global wind turbine supply within the decade. Now let's talk about electric vehicles, the most visible battlefield in the green energy competition. 10 years ago, the global EV market was a curiosity. Tesla was an expensive American niche product. Chinese EVs were cheap, low quality, and laughed at in Western markets. Today, BYD, a Chinese company founded as a battery manufacturer in 1995, is the world's largest EV seller. It overtook Tesla in total EV sales in 2023. Chinese EV brands BYD, NIO, Li Auto, SAIC offer vehicles with competitive technology, sophisticated software, and prices that European and American manufacturers simply cannot match. A BYD Seagull, a fully electric city car, sells in China for approximately $10,000. A comparable Western EV costs 3 to 4 times as much. This price gap is not because Chinese workers are paid poverty wages. Labor is a small fraction of EV cost. It's because Chinese companies have vertically integrated the entire supply chain. BYD makes its own batteries. It has secured its own lithium supply. It operates its own semiconductor production. It controls its supply chain from mineral to showroom in a way no Western automaker can currently match. The Western response has been tariffs. The U.S. imposed 100% tariffs on Chinese EVs in 2024. The EU imposed tariffs of up to 45%. Tariffs protect domestic industries from competition, but they don't make domestic industries more competitive. They just make imported alternatives more expensive for consumers. The fundamental challenge that Chinese EV manufacturers are genuinely more cost competitive because of supply chain integration doesn't go away because of a tariff. It just gets temporarily hidden. Let's talk about the strategic implications, because this isn't just an economic competition, it's a geopolitical one. The 20th century was defined by oil dependence. Countries that controlled oil controlled geopolitical leverage. The Middle East became the most strategically important region on Earth because of what was under its sand. The 21st century green energy transition was supposed to liberate the world from that dependence. Sunshine and wind are everywhere. Nobody can embargo the sun. But the transition from oil to renewables hasn't eliminated resource dependence. It has replaced oil dependence with mineral dependence, and mineral processing dependence, and manufacturing dependence. And all three of those dependencies currently lead to the same place, China. A Europe that runs on Chinese solar panels, Chinese batteries, and Chinese processed rare earths is not energy independent. It has traded dependence on Saudi Arabia for dependence on Beijing. This is the uncomfortable core of the green energy geopolitical story. The transition was supposed to be liberating. It has, so far, created a new form of strategic vulnerability. In 2023, China restricted exports of gallium and germanium, two minerals used in semiconductors and solar panels, citing national security concerns. Prices spiked globally within weeks. In 2024, China expanded those restrictions to include graphite, a key component in EV batteries. The message was clear: we control the supply chain, and we are willing to use that control. This is the rare earth moment of 2010, the Japan warning, scaled up and applied globally. And this time, the West is paying attention. The question is whether it's paying attention fast enough. Now let's ask the harder question. How did China pull this off? Because the answer isn't simply they cheated. The real answer is more instructive and more uncomfortable. Part 1. China thought in decades. The decision to dominate green energy manufacturing was made in the early 2000s when solar panels were expensive curiosities and EVs were science fiction. China's leadership looked at where energy technology was heading and made 20-year bets. Western governments made 4-year bets because elections happen every 4 years. Part 2. China coordinated government and industry in ways democratic systems find difficult. State banks lent to strategic manufacturers at below market rates. State grid companies guaranteed purchase volumes. Local governments provided land and infrastructure. This isn't corruption. It's industrial policy at a scale and consistency that democratic governments, subject to changing administrations and lobby groups, struggle to match. Part 3. China was willing to accept losses for market share. Chinese solar manufacturers lost money for years, subsidized by government support, while driving down prices and driving out competitors. Western companies, accountable to shareholders and quarterly earnings, couldn't absorb equivalent losses. They exited the market. China filled the vacuum. Part 4. China invested in human capital. Chinese universities produce more engineers per year than any country on Earth. Those engineers went to work in battery factories, solar manufacturers, and EV companies, building institutional knowledge that compounds over decades. None of these advantages required espionage or rule breaking. They required patience, coordination, and a willingness to prioritize long-term strategic position over short-term profit. The West simply chose differently. Now let's look at what the West is actually doing to respond, because the picture is more active than the green energy headlines suggest. The United States passed the Inflation Reduction Act in 2022, the largest climate investment in American history. $369 billion in clean energy subsidies, tax credits, and manufacturing incentives. The IRA is explicitly designed to rebuild American clean energy manufacturing, to create the same kind of industrial policy China used, applied to the American context. Early results are promising. Over $300 billion in private clean energy manufacturing investment has been announced in the U.S. since the IRA passed. Battery gigafactories in Georgia and Kentucky, solar panel plants in Ohio and Texas. But here's the reality check. These factories are being announced. Most aren't built yet. The ones being built won't reach full production for years, and they depend heavily on Chinese equipment and Chinese processed materials to get started. You cannot build a battery gigafactory without Chinese lithium processing. You cannot build solar panel factories without Chinese polysilicon. The supply chain dependency doesn't disappear because you've broken ground on a new factory. Europe's response has been less coordinated. The EU has green industrial ambitions, but has struggled with member state disagreements, permitting delays, and a regulatory environment that makes large-scale manufacturing investment slower and more expensive than in the US or China. European battery manufacturers, Northvolt being the most prominent, have faced severe financial difficulties. Northvolt filed for bankruptcy protection in late 2024, a significant blow to Europe's battery ambitions. The gap between Western ambition and Western execution in green energy manufacturing remains substantial. And China is not standing still while the West tries to catch up. Let's talk about Africa, because this is the next frontier in the resource competition, and it's playing out largely out of Western view. Africa holds an extraordinary concentration of the minerals the green energy transition needs. Congo's cobalt, Zambia's copper, Zimbabwe's lithium, South Africa's platinum, Tanzania's graphite. China recognized this opportunity early and has been investing across Africa for 2 decades through Belt and Road infrastructure projects, mining investments, and diplomatic relationships. Chinese companies now control significant stakes in mining operations across the continent. Chinese-built railways move African minerals to Chinese-built ports. Chinese ships carry those minerals to Chinese processing facilities. The West, which spent decades lecturing African governments about governance and democracy while offering relatively little investment, is now scrambling to compete for relationships it neglected. The U.S. Libido Corridor Project, a railway investment in Central Africa, is a direct attempt to build an alternative to Chinese infrastructure. The EU's Global Gateway Initiative is another, but China has a 20-year head start. And African governments, who remember the conditionality and lectures that came with Western aid, are not automatically going to choose Western partnerships over established Chinese ones. The battle for African minerals is the next chapter in the green energy resource competition, and right now, China is winning it too. Now let's get to the cracks, because China's green energy dominance is real, but it is not without serious vulnerabilities. Crack 1. Geopolitical overreach. China's aggressive resource acquisition, export restrictions, and Belt and Road debt controversies have alarmed countries that were previously neutral. The 2023 gallium and germanium export restrictions didn't just raise prices, they accelerated Western investment in alternative supply chains, the exact opposite of what Beijing may have intended. Every time China weaponizes a supply chain, it gives Western governments the political justification and the urgency to fund the expensive, slow process of building alternatives. China's leverage is real, but using it visibly risks destroying it. A supply chain dependency that everyone knows about becomes a supply chain dependency that everyone is motivated to eliminate. Crack 2. Quality and trust. Chinese solar panels and batteries are price competitive. But questions about long-term quality, warranty support, and cybersecurity in Chinese connected energy infrastructure are real concerns for Western utilities and governments. Several Western countries have restricted or banned Chinese solar inverters, the components that connect solar arrays to the grid, citing cybersecurity concerns about Chinese manufactured hardware with remote access capabilities. A solar farm is infrastructure. Infrastructure that can potentially be switched off remotely by a foreign government is a national security risk. And that concern is slowing Chinese green energy market penetration in security-sensitive markets. Crack 3. Domestic overcapacity. China's green energy manufacturing subsidies have created massive overcapacity. Solar panel factories running at 50% utilization, battery manufacturers producing more cells than the market can absorb. This overcapacity is why Chinese solar panels are so cheap and why Chinese manufacturers are under enormous pressure to find export markets. But it also means the industry is structurally dependent on government support that cannot continue indefinitely. When Chinese government subsidies eventually moderate, as they must given China's own fiscal pressures, the economics of Chinese green manufacturing will look different, and some of the cost advantage will narrow. Crack 4. The innovation question. And this is perhaps the most consequential long-term vulnerability. China is extraordinarily good at manufacturing scale, cost reduction, and incremental improvement of established technologies. This is documented and undeniable. But the next generation of green energy technology, solid-state batteries, advanced nuclear fusion, green hydrogen at scale, next-generation solar cells, requires the kind of open, collaborative, risk-tolerant research environment that China's system has historically struggled to produce. Solid-state batteries, which could double EV range and eliminate fire risk, are being developed primarily by Toyota in Japan, QuantumScape backed by Volkswagen and several U.S. startups, not by Chinese companies. Green hydrogen, potentially the key to decarbonizing heavy industry and long-haul transport, is being pioneered in Europe and Australia. China is investing, but not leading. If the next energy transition is built on technologies that don't yet exist, and China doesn't lead their development, today's manufacturing dominance doesn't automatically translate into tomorrow's strategic control. The West has a window. It requires sustained investment in basic research, willingness to fund long-shot technologies, and the patience to wait for breakthroughs that may take decades. None of these are Western political strengths right now. Crack 5. The internal economic pressure. China is not in a position of unconstrained strength. Its property crisis has devastated household wealth and consumer confidence. Its demographic decline is accelerating. Youth unemployment hit record highs in 2023 before the government stopped publishing the data. Sustaining massive green energy manufacturing subsidies while managing a property debt crisis, an aging population, and slowing economic growth, that is a genuinely difficult balancing act. The green energy industrial policy that looks invincible from the outside is, from the inside, competing with enormous fiscal pressures for limited government resources. If China's economy slows significantly, and serious economists believe it will, the subsidies that built its green dominance become harder to maintain, and the cost advantages that look permanent start to look contingent. So, where does this leave the world? Let me give you the honest assessment. China has built the most comprehensive control over the green energy supply chain in history. From mine to panel, from mineral to battery, it's a dominance that took 20 years and cannot be dismantled quickly. The West woke up late, very late. The IRA, the EU Green Deal, Japan's green industrial policy, these are serious responses, but they are responses to a race that China started winning 2 decades ago. Catching up is possible. It requires sustained political will, consistent industrial policy across multiple administrations, and a tolerance for the slow, expensive process of rebuilding supply chains from scratch. All three of those requirements are difficult for democracies. Sustained political will across administrations is especially hard when the party in power changes and priorities shift irrelevant. The U.S. passed the IRA in 2022. By 2025, political debates about whether to roll back IRA incentives had already begun. That instability is exactly what China's 20-year strategy was designed to outlast. But here's what I want to leave you with, because this story isn't simply about China winning and the West losing. The green energy transition is happening. Solar is now the cheapest electricity source in history, partly because Chinese manufacturing drove down costs. That benefits the whole world, including the climate. The fact that Chinese solar panels are cheap and available has accelerated renewable deployment globally. Countries that couldn't afford solar a decade ago can now afford it. That is genuinely good for the planet. The geopolitical problem and the climate solution are in tension with each other. Cheap Chinese clean energy helps fight climate change. Dependence on Chinese clean energy creates strategic vulnerability. Resolving that tension, building enough domestic and allied manufacturing capacity to ensure strategic resilience without making clean energy so expensive that the climate transition stalls, is the central energy policy challenge of the next decade. China has cornered the market on everything green energy needs. That is true, documented, and consequential. But corners can be escaped. Supply chains can be rebuilt. Technologies can shift. The dominance that looks permanent rarely is, in energy markets as in everything else. The question isn't whether the West can compete, it's whether it can sustain the political will to compete across the decade or more it will take to genuinely close the gap. History suggests that's the hardest part. Not the engineering, not the investment, the politics of sustained attention to a problem that doesn't explode dramatically. It just quietly determines who controls the future. China understood that 20 years ago. The West is understanding it now. Whether now is soon enough, that's the question this decade will answer. That's the context that's been missing. Subscribe for more, and tell me in the comments, do you think the West can catch up, or has China already won this one? See you next time.